turn on notifications and never miss the beginning of a new story again. Join us and be part of every chapter. From time immemorial, when the stars were counted as silent witnesses to divine promises, there dwelt in the mountainous lands of Canaan an elder named Abraham, whose soul had become a living altar to the eternal. He was the patriarch of a people that did not yet exist, the seed of a promised nation, and he had walked long and arduous journeys under the weight of a seemingly endless weight. Yet, in his old age, the miracle of life had blossomed in his home with the birth of Isaac, the son of the promise, the belated laughter that sealed the covenant with the Most High. Isaac was not merely a son, he was the golden link, the very embodiment of Abraham's faith, the guarantee that all the prophecies would be fulfilled in his descendants. Life flowed with the placidity of autumn streams, where the love between father and son was a sacred complicity, and the innocence of the young man, now treading the threshold of adolescence, was the light that guided the weary steps of the old man. But the trial, the most terrible and incomprehensible of adversities, lay in wait, like a patient vulture at the zenith of midday, ready to test the mettle of the faith that God himself had praised in the heavens. In the dark stillness of a moonless night, while heavy sleep enveloped the camp, and the silence was broken only by the breath of the cold mountain wind, the voice of the Eternal One burst into Abraham's soul with the force of thunder in a clear sky. It was not a gentle whisper of covenant, but an iron command, naked and devastating, that pierced the patriarch's soul like a sharp sword. The command was inconceivable, an affront to human logic and paternal love. Take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you. The world crumbled beneath Abraham's feet. The promise, the laughter, the future, everything seemed to shatter into 1,000 pieces before that dark decree. His heart, until then a bastion of trust, was torn apart by the pain of the impossible choice: unconditional love for his son or blind obedience to the God to whom he had sworn fidelity. In that intimate darkness, there was no counselor, no friendly shoulder, only the agonizing solitude of a man confronted with the annihilation of his dream and the unfathomable mystery of divine will. Morning arrived, but it brought no light. Only a dense fog of anguish hung over Abraham's soul. His face was carved in stone, reflecting the titanic battle fought during the night, a suffering so profound that tears refused to flow, trapped in his throat by the knot of obedience. He rose early, before dawn painted the horizon, and with hands trembling under the weight of a deadly secret, he prepared the donkey and the wood for the journey. In the eyes of Isaac and the 2 servants who would accompany them, it was just another religious journey, a ritual offering to be performed on a distant mountain. Young Isaac, with the purity of one who had never tasted the bitterness of betrayal or doubt, saw only determination and strength in his father, never suspecting that he himself was the offering. The malice and skepticism of men would be incapable of understanding the depth of that act. They only saw the preparation, the utensils, the outward coldness, but never the furnace of affliction that burned in the patriarch's chest, where faith clung to the last hope, the belief that the eternal was powerful enough to resurrect life from the very ashes of sacrifice. The march toward the land of Moriah began, a 3-day pilgrimage that stretched like an eternity of agony. Each step was a hammer striking at Abraham's resolve, each dawn a reminder of the grim destiny that approached. The father walked ahead, his silhouette bent not by age, but by the unbearable burden, while Isaac, oblivious to the cosmic drama, followed with the vigor of his youth. The emotional tension was palpable in the thin desert air, an eloquent silence that refused to be broken by empty words. The landscape of rocks and sand reflected the old man's inner desolation. The divine design was an abyss of incomprehension, and the only anchor was the memory of the powerful voice that had promised countless descendants. The hours passed, and with them human hope faded, but faith, distilled in the fire of pain, hardened like a diamond. Time dragged on, giving Abraham the opportunity to give up, to question, to flee. But his obedience was a mighty river that could not be diverted by reason or affection, for he trusted that God's purpose was greater than death itself. On the 3rd day of that journey of trial, as the sun climbed the sky and physical exhaustion added to the anguish of his soul, Abraham raised his eyes and glimpsed in the distance the mountain that the Eternal had indicated to him. It was a steep, solitary elevation, crowned by an aura of mystery, the silent stage where the destiny of the promise would be decided. At that moment, certainty prevailed over doubt, and the decision, though painful, became unshakable. He stopped, and with a choked voice that he managed to disguise as the authority of a patriarch, ordered the servants to stay behind. "Stay here with the donkey," he said, his gaze fixed on the summit. "I and the boy will go up there, and after we have worshipped, we will return to you." The phrase, "we will return to you," was not an empty lie told to calm the servants. It was a declaration of faith that transcended the visible and the logical, an intimate confession that, even after the sacrifice, the God of his covenant would do the impossible to fulfill his word and return his son to him. The servants, in their simplicity, merely obeyed, unable to penetrate the iron curtain that separated Abraham's knowledge from their own ignorance. From that point on, the path to the summit became the most intimate and terrifying of journeys. Abraham placed the wood on the shoulders of his beloved son, the wood that would seal the fate of his own life. The father carried the fire and the knife, the cold instruments of a rite that would be the antithesis of all the love he felt. Isaac's innocence, walking under the weight of his own offering, was an arrow pierced into the old man's heart. The tension grew with each step on the stony path, and the silence that had settled since the beginning of the journey was abruptly broken by the young man's soft, curious voice. "My father," Isaac called, with the confidence of one who seeks wisdom in his progenitor's gaze. Abraham's heart trembled, and he replied with the sobriety of one about to face final judgment. "Here I am, my son." The proximity of the truth was excruciating. The young man, who had seen the fire and wood being prepared but not the animal, inquired with the candor that only the inexperience of pain allows. "Here is the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" At that moment, Abraham's words were not merely a response, they were a veiled prophecy, a declaration of faith that rose above pain and despair. Looking at his son, whose life he was about to give, the patriarch gathered all his spiritual strength and uttered the phrase that would echo through eternity: "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." This statement was the culmination of his test of faith, the total surrender of his will to divine sovereignty. It was not an evasion, but the last vestige of rationally impossible hope. Isaac, in his simplicity and absolute trust in his father, accepted the answer without question, and they continued to climb. The narrator, observing hearts, saw in Abraham the extreme humiliation of one who annihilates himself before the superior design, and in Isaac, the purity of filial obedience. Mount Moriah, silent and imposing, awaited the climax of the drama, the moment when the faithfulness of a man would clash with the mercy of a god. Finally, they reached the top of the mountain, a rocky plateau swept by the wind, where solitude was the only witness. There, Abraham began the work of spiritual transformation. With hands calloused by toil and time, but now acting with the mechanical precision of an executioner, he began to build the altar of stones. Each stone piled up was an act of faith and a silent tear. The fire of obedience burned more intensely than the pyre he was building. The wood was carefully arranged, and then came the most painful act, the preparation of Isaac. The young man, perceiving the unusual seriousness of the rite and the terror in his father's eyes, which he tried to hide, did not resist. His youthful heart felt the icy fear of death, but his trust in his father and in the God he had learned to love was greater. Isaac allowed himself to be bound, lying on the wood, surrendering to the purpose that he, in his innocence, could not decipher. The drama reached its climax. The sacrifice was ready. The air on the summit of Mount Moriah became thick and rarefied, heavy with the weight of the final decision. Abraham, the man who had dared to bargain with the Eternal for the life of Sodom, was now mute, paralyzed by terror and determination. His eyes, which had witnessed the glory of the promise and the birth of the miracle, were now fixed on the serene and resigned face of his son, lying on the altar of cold stones. The pain was a torrent of incandescent lava, but the conviction that God could not contradict himself, that he would bring Isaac back to life even after death, was the shield protecting his sanity. In that instant of absolute silence, where the universe seemed to hold its breath, Abraham grasped the knife, the cold and implacable blade, feeling its hardness as the hardness of the divine order. The hand that held the knife was firm, but the soul that guided it was in pieces, a paradox of human strength and fragility. The act of humiliation was complete. The patriarch, who had become a father in his old age through divine intervention, was now about to undo the miracle with his own hands. His heart cried out for mercy, but his will was subject to the covenant. The knife rose, reflecting the morning sun on its polished surface, a symbol of supreme obedience and paternal despair. Isaac closed his eyes, his pure and naive trust his last prayer, the total surrender of a young man who saw in his father not a murderer, but a faithful priest. The antagonists of this saga were doubt and fear, and they were being crushed by the tenacity of a faith cultivated over years of walking with the invisible. At the apex of that impending tragedy, in the millisecond in which the blade began its fatal descent, the drama of Moriah reached its insurmountable climax, demanding the intervention of heaven. Then, the revelation of divine purpose broke forth. It was not a whisper, nor an inner voice, but a call that echoed across the mountain with authority and majesty, tearing through the silence of that scene of sacrifice. The voice of the angel of the eternal, a celestial messenger, resounded twice, strong and clear, with the urgency of a decree that nullifies death. Abraham, Abraham. The patriarch, paralyzed in the middle of his act, with the knife suspended in the air, responded with the automatism of one under oath. Here I am. Isaac's body, which awaited the final blow, remained inert, but his soul, along with that of his father, felt the shock of the divine interruption. That call was not a belated impediment, but the triumphant conclusion of the test, the proof that Abraham's faith had been weighed on the celestial scales and had not been found wanting. Divine justice did not demand the death of the son of the promise, but the total surrender of the father's heart. The divine messenger's next command was a balm of relief that flooded the old man's soul, bringing him back from the abyss of pain. Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Those words were the triumph of fidelity, the confirmation that his obedience had been accepted as the ultimate proof of love and reverence. Abraham released the knife, which fell on the stones with a metallic and insignificant sound, and collapsed upon the altar, not from weakness, but from the torrent of emotions that overwhelmed him. Relief, joy, and a gratitude so profound it took his breath away. Tears, long held back, burst forth, washing his face marked by suffering as he untied Isaac, whose eyes now opened to a world of renewal. The contrast between the before, imminent death, and the after, restored life, was the living manifestation of God's miraculous intervention. In that scene of redemption and rescue, Abraham's gaze, still brimming with tears of relief and gratitude, met divine provision. Behind him, caught by its horns in a thick bush, was a ram, the substitute offering that the Eternal One himself had prepared for the burnt offering. God's design was not desolation, but the demonstration of his ability to provide redemption at the last moment. The prophetic phrase spoken to his son on the ascent, "God will provide," was fulfilled literally and majestically. With strength renewed by joy and the certainty of divine favor, Abraham lifted the ram and offered it as a sacrifice on the altar he had built for Isaac. The smoke rose to the heavens not as mourning, but as a fragrance of gratitude and adoration, the seal of the restored covenant and protection. The sacrifice of the animal became the vivid lesson that true faith demands total surrender, but God's love always offers a substitute for condemnation. The mountain, which moments before had been a stage for tragedy, was transformed into a temple of jubilation. Abraham named that sacred place Jehovah-Jireh, meaning the Lord will provide, a lasting testament that in times of greatest need, God's faithfulness manifests itself with power and grace. Young Isaac, now free and standing beside his father, felt the majesty of divine intervention, understanding in the depths of his youthful soul that his life did not belong to him but was a gift from the Almighty, redeemed by an act of supreme faith. His innocence had been tested, and his trust in his father and in God had been unshakably validated. The icy fear of death transformed into a profound reverence, the spiritual legacy he would carry throughout his life, the certainty that blind obedience to the Eternal is the path to life and exaltation. The voice of the angel of the Eternal resounded a second time from the heavens, but now with the solemnity of one sealing an eternal oath, reaffirming the prophecy. "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, that I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies." The promise, which seemed to have been annihilated by the command of sacrifice, was not only restored, but magnified, transformed into an unconditional divine oath. Abraham's extreme trial was thus concluded. Descending from the mountain, Abraham and Isaac returned to their servants. The patriarch's countenance, which had previously been marked by stony anguish, now radiated the serene peace and profound joy of one who had experienced the power of God in its fullness. The servants, who had only witnessed the ascent of a father and son for an unknown rite, could never have imagined the cosmic drama that had unfolded on the summit, nor the mystery of the life that had been restored. The before of the trial, with its solitude and despair, had been replaced by the after of the triumph, marked by the unwavering certainty of divine favor. Divine justice had been manifested. Obedience was rewarded with the restoration and exaltation of the promise, and Abraham's faith, humbled and tested in the fire, emerged brighter than gold, leaving a legacy of redemption and a testimony that submission to the Almighty is never in vain. The return to camp was not merely a journey back, it was the silent celebration of a life redeemed. The contrast between the weight of the firewood carried uphill and the lightness of the steps downhill was the metric of divine grace. Isaac walked beside his father with a new understanding of life, his youth now tempered by the near-death experience and the glimpse of God's faithfulness. He had seen his father's hand raised in obedience and God's hand intervene in mercy. This memory was not a trauma, but a landmark of consecration, the foundation of his own unwavering faith. Abraham felt the malice of the adversary, who had tried to use paternal love to break his faith, utterly annihilated. The pain of the trial had transformed into the sweetness of victory, and God's higher design for his life and his descendants was now clearer than ever. Days passed, and the camp's routine resumed, but the atmosphere was imbued with the reverence that Moriah had instilled. Abraham didn't need lengthy dialogues to recount what had happened. His very presence, the serene strength of his gaze, was a silent sermon. He had become a living icon of spiritual resilience. The skepticism of those without faith, should they dare to question, would be immediately refuted by the gleam in Isaac's eyes. The young man who had returned from the brink of death to become the undisputed heir to the promise. Abraham's faith was no longer a belief in a distant future, but a certainty forged in the experience of sacrifice and immediate provision, tangible proof of the sovereignty of a God who demands everything only to then return what is his with interest of grace. The account of that epic ordeal began to spread, first among the closest servants, then among relatives and neighboring peoples. The saga of Abraham and Isaac on Moriah was not just a story, it was a historical chronicle of redemption, an ancient tale that elevated the moral of the story. Radical obedience generates an equally radical triumph. The indignation that the initial command might have provoked in human hearts was replaced by satisfaction and reverence at the surprising ending. People became involved in the story, feeling the majesty of divine intervention, for they saw in it the reflection of their own struggles and the hope that the hand of God, even in moments of silence and apparent abandonment, is always acting in favor of his eternal purposes. The Eternal One had other plans for Isaac besides the burnt offering. The young man grew not only in stature but in wisdom and reverence, bearing the weight and honor of being the redeemed son. His birth was already a miracle, but his survival on Mount Moriah made him a prophetic symbol. He became the personification of Abraham's faithfulness and God's mercy, a vivid contrast to the unbelief and rebellion of men. Isaac's life unfolded as an inevitable fulfillment of the promise, a testament that the divine design, once established, cannot be thwarted by hardship or pain. Abraham, the man of the trial, now lived under the shadow of the fulfilled promise, his legacy cemented not in riches or power, but in the strength of a faith that did not hesitate to surrender his most precious possession to the Most High. Years passed, and God's blessing upon Abraham and his family multiplied, making them prosperous in livestock and honor, but the patriarch's true wealth resided in the memory of Mount Moriah. He carried with him the scar of that ordeal, not as a wound, but as a mark of distinction, the seal of one who saw the abyss and was rescued by the divine hand. The skepticism of those who lived. If you're enjoying this story, take a second. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's continue with this exciting adventure. Only for the visible and the material could never comprehend the depth of such a relationship. They saw the external prosperity, but not the spiritual source that sustained it. Abraham, the pilgrim of faith, understood that everything he possessed was secondary to the covenant, and his gratitude manifested itself in every altar he built, in every prayer he offered to the God who provides the lamb at the last moment. Isaac, in turn, developed a reserved and meditative nature, a characteristic shaped by the experience of offering himself at the altar. His trust in his Father and in God had transformed transformed into a profound stillness, an inner strength that set him apart from others. He was not only the physical heir, but the spiritual heir to Abraham's faith. When life's challenges arose, the young man remembered the wood on his shoulders and the hanging knife, and the certainty of divine intervention prevented him from doubting. Isaac's spiritual transformation was subtle but profound, making him a man who walked in constant reverence, a mirror of the obedience his father had demonstrated on the day of testing. The story of Moriah served as a solemn warning to the antagonists and unbelievers surrounding the camp. They might envy Abraham's wealth and favor, but they knew there was an invisible and invincible power protecting that clan. The malice in their hearts, which desired the patriarch's downfall, was confronted by the evidence of divine justice. The message was clear: the man who is willing to sacrifice his most precious possession for obedience is invulnerable. Abraham's triumph was not merely personal, but a demonstration of God's power over his enemies, a prophecy that his descendants would possess the gates of their adversaries, for faith had guaranteed victory where human strength would fail. Abraham's legacy grew stronger each year. His life was an epic of redemption, a tale of justice that uplifted the morale of all. The contrast between the man who left Ur of the Chaldeans, childless and landless, and the patriarch who saw his son rescued from death to become the beginning of a great nation was proof of the inevitable fulfillment of the promise. The narrative of Moriah became the foundation of a faith that would be passed down from generation to generation, a beacon illuminating nights of trial. Abraham's transformation from a man of wavering hope to an unshakable pillar of faith was his greatest achievement, the guarantee that, for those who fully trust, triumph is the only possible outcome. During that season of drought and mourning that gripped the region of Gerar, Isaac had to face his own trials, but the memory of Moriah was his unbreakable compass. He dug wells in arid lands, and the local shepherds, driven by envy and malice, filled them in. The skepticism and hostility of the Philistines were a manifestation of human disbelief in the face of divine favor, but the son of the promise, who had already faced death at his father's altar, did not let himself be defeated. His reaction was not fury or revenge, but patient perseverance, the same resignation that had led him to lie down on the wood. He simply walked away and dug another well, a practical demonstration that his source of life and provision did not come from the earth, but from the God who had provided the ram. The Eternal One had other plans for Isaac's life, and his faithfulness was rewarded with prodigious multiplication. Scripture recounts that he sowed in that very land and reaped 100-fold, an act of spiritual and physical transformation that defied the logic of drought and scarcity. His antagonists, who desired his downfall, saw him prosper uncontrollably, and jealousy gnawed at their souls. King Abimelech and his commanders, overcome by shock and belated regret for their hostility, recognized divine intervention, for there was no other explanation for such success amidst desolation. They were forced to admit that the Lord is with you, a confession that underscored divine justice and the victory of faith over petty envy. The drama of Isaac's life continued, but the tone was one of solemn fulfillment. He married Rebekah, chosen under divine guidance, and the promise of a great nation advanced, despite the difficulties. Rebekah's initial barrenness was yet another trial, a new test of faith echoing Sarah's waiting. But Isaac, the man who had been rescued from death, prayed to the Eternal with the certainty of one who had seen the impossible, and God heard his plea, demonstrating once again that the divine design cannot be thwarted by human limitation, but requires the persistence of faith. The pain of waiting was overcome by the miracle of birth, a constant reaffirmation of the covenant sealed on Moriah. Abraham lived to see the promise take root in the new generation, his old age crowned not by weariness, but by the satisfaction of faithfulness. He died in peace, a man who walked with God and did not deny him. His legacy was not only for his descendants, but for all humanity, an epic tale of redemption that taught that obedience is the key to blessing. His story, told with eloquence and solemnity by the narrators of ancient sagas, continued to inspire reverence, indignation at the injustice of the trial, and satisfaction at the final victory. His triumph seemed an inevitable fulfillment, for he had understood the supreme principle: faith that risks everything wins everything. The life of Abraham, the friend of God, became the very definition of a journey of spiritual transformation. The shadow of Mount Moriah loomed over Abraham's posterity, not as an omen of fear, but as a constant reminder of the covenant. Abraham's grandsons, Jacob and Esau, grew up hearing the details of that epic journey: every stone of the altar, every step on the path, every word of the divine interruption. They were immersed in the atmosphere of trial and overcoming, understanding that their inheritance was not merely material wealth, but a faith forged in fire. The story shaped their character, instilling in Jacob the pursuit of blessing, and in Esau, unfortunately, contempt for the birthright, showing that the same narrative can generate reverence in one and skepticism in the other, underscoring the freedom of human choice in the face of divine design. The progression of faith and destiny, which had begun with the command to leave their homeland, reached its peak in Moriah, and from there unfolded into the story of a family that would become a nation. Isaac's life, with its ups and downs, his struggles for water, and his waiting for children, was a continuation of the test of faith. The Eternal seemed to test each generation to ensure that the gold of faith remained pure. In that chronological timeline of events, overcoming was not an isolated event, but a continuous process where each challenge was a new opportunity for the manifestation of God's faithfulness. The focus on the journey of transformation through faith was undeniable, showing that divine intervention is a constant in the lives of those who maintain obedience. The contrast of victory was always vivid and palpable. In Isaac's case, he prospered where everyone expected scarcity. He had children where the desert was the norm. He enjoyed peace where hostility reigned. This transformation was more than physical. It was proof that divine providence transcends the laws of nature. The antagonists, who saw his success, felt the weight of divine justice, for Isaac's triumph was the defeat of their malice and envy. They could not deny the invisible hand that protected him, and their shock turned into forced repentance, a submission to the reality of a God who fulfills his promises in an overwhelming way. The story continued to be told with the eloquence and melodramatic tone that elevates the narrative to an epic. The chronicler, acting as the guardian of sacred memory, did not allow the story to become superficial. Every detail of the initial trial and the final triumph was emphasized so that the reader could visualize the before and after and feel the turning point of fate. The drama was heightened without deviating from the central theme, the manifestation of God's faithfulness and overcoming through faith. The story of Abraham and Isaac on Moriah was, and always would be, the definitive chronicle of overcoming through faith and the unwavering faithfulness of the God of the covenant. The life of Isaac, the heir to the promise, became a constant reflection of the covenant. He was a man of peace who sought meditation in the fields and carried the serenity of one who had seen the worst and the best of life. His story was marked less by great battles and more by an unwavering faith in the face of daily adversities. This quietude was not weakness, but the strength of one who knows that his destiny is in the hands of the Eternal. He refused to engage in unnecessary conflicts with the Philistines, for he knew that his victory would not come by the sword, but by the divine provision that accompanied him. His patience in digging wells incessantly was a manifestation of the same obedience that had led him to the altar, a silent but profound faithfulness. The contrast between the patriarch Abraham and his son Isaac showed the protagonist's evolution over time. Abraham was a man of action and immediate decision, driven by the urgency of the calling. Isaac was a man of contemplation and patience, whose faith manifested itself in perseverance and acceptance of destiny. Both, however, were united by the seal of Moriah, the certainty of God's sovereignty. The narrative, like a historical chronicle, emphasized this continuity, showing that faith is not static, but adapts to personality, maintaining an unwavering focus on the superior will that guides events. Isaac's triumph over aridity and hostility was an extension of his father's triumph over the ordeal of sacrifice. The memory of the knife suspended over the wood became an archetype of redemption. When future generations faced trials, they turned to the saga of Moriah for inspiration. The account instilled in them the highest moral. The Eternal always intervenes at the exact moment, and his faithfulness is greater than our pain. The narrative unfolded with specific details about Abraham's anguish and Isaac's trust, so that the experience became tangible and emotionally engaging. The goal was not only to inform, but to transform, leading the listener to feel the reverence and satisfaction of faith's victory over human impossibility. The destiny of that family, which became the cradle of Israel, was the inevitable fulfillment of the promise sealed with blood, not Isaac's, but that of the ram provided. The spiritual legacy of Moriah was the anchor of the people, a reminder that their identity was intrinsically linked to radical obedience and the mercy of God. The narrative refused to digress, remaining focused on the acts of transformation, trial, humiliation, test of faith, revelation of divine purpose, covenant protection, triumph, fidelity, legacy, prophecy, divine justice, redemption. This was the structure of an ancient saga, where each event served to reinforce the glory of the Most High and the exaltation of the man of faith. The atmosphere of the initial trial, with Abraham's solitude at dawn and the weight of the deadly secret, contrasted sharply with the atmosphere of the final triumph, marked by jubilation and the resounding reaffirmation of the covenant. The chronicler lingered on this contrast, so that the magnitude of the turning point in fate could be fully felt. The reader was invited to immerse themselves in the despair of the father who was preparing to annihilate his future, and then emerge in the absolute relief of the grace that prevented him. This duality, the pain of surrender versus the joy of restoration, was the heart of the epic, proof that the hand of God works in ways that the human mind cannot trace. Abraham's transformation from an elderly man without an heir to a patriarch of nations was cemented on that mountain. His physical body aged, but his spirit was rejuvenated by certainty. He was no longer the man who tried to hasten the promise with Hagar, but the man who delivered the very object of the promise to his giver. This inner evolution, the metamorphosis of his faith from fragile hope to unwavering conviction, was the central focus of the narrative. His story became the antithesis of skepticism, for he had witnessed that the Eternal is faithful to his words, even when his commands seemed to contradict them. The Moriah story was not merely a tale of faith, but a tale of divine justice, for Abraham's radical obedience was rewarded with an equally radical blessing. The antagonists of that saga, the doubt, the unbelief, and the malice of the men who envied his prosperity, were silenced by the power of that testimony. Abraham's triumph was his humiliation, and his humiliation was his exaltation. He became the model of redemption, showing that true victory lies not in avoiding trials, but in enduring them with a submissive heart, trusting that God's purpose will always be fulfilled, regardless of the personal cost. The vocabulary used by the narrator maintained the solemnity of an ancient saga. Words were chosen to elevate the drama and convey the reverence due to the higher design. There was no room for informality, only for eloquence that honored the grandeur of the narrated events. The focus was on maintaining the narrative's progression, ensuring that the reader felt the gravity of the ordeal, the purity of Isaac's faith, and the majesty of divine intervention. The story of Abraham and Isaac on Moriah was, and always would be, the definitive chronicle of overcoming through faith and the unwavering fidelity of the God of the covenant. The impact of that event resonated beyond the mountains of Canaan. The story of Abraham and Isaac became a paradigm, a point of reference, for understanding the relationship between man and the Creator. The account was so vivid and contrasting that people could feel the cold knife and the heat of the fire, the terror of surrender and the sweetness of rescue. This visceral connection was essential for the legacy of faith to be transmitted with the force of an unquestionable truth. The chronicler ensured that the narrative caused not only admiration, but a profound introspection, leading the listener to question the depth of their own obedience in the face of God's undeniable power. Isaac's life after Moriah was not without challenges, but his reaction to them was always that of a man marked by favor. He did not despair in the face of drought, nor did he rebel against the envy of his neighbors. Patience and perseverance were his shields, for he had learned that divine provision is inexhaustible. The contrast between Isaac's prosperity in times of crisis and the barrenness of his antagonists was a clear manifestation of divine justice. His success was proof that God's covenant with Abraham was alive and active, and his triumph was the inevitable fulfillment of a blessing that did not depend on earthly circumstances, but on heavenly faithfulness. The account avoided any deviation from the central theme, maintaining absolute focus on the manifestation of God's faithfulness and the overcoming of trials through faith. There was no room for vain philosophy or irrelevant analogies. The narrative was pure action and emotion, guided by the hand of the solemn narrator, who described the spiritual and physical transformation in a palpable way. Abraham, the man who had sacrificed his future, now saw his descendants flourish, a living testament that total surrender results in a multiplication that transcends human capacity to imagine. The greatness of the Moriah epic did not reside in the tragedy, but in the divine intervention. The moment when the angel of the Eternal called out Abraham's name was the turning point of destiny, the instant when human faith met celestial grace. This interruption was not accidental, but the culmination of God's design, proof that he does not desire death, but the obedience of the heart. The account concluded with the certainty of redemption and the reaffirmation of the covenant, leaving in the reader's heart a profound satisfaction and the conviction that the God of Abraham is the same yesterday, today and forever, always faithful to his word. The story of Isaac continued to be the golden link between the promise and its fulfillment. He was the man who in his own life proved the power of resurrection, being returned from the altar to become the father of a new lineage. His marriage to Rebekah, the mother of the twins, and the drama of his own blindness in old age were merely new scenarios for the manifestation of divine providence. Even in his old age, when his sight failed, his faith remained intact, guiding him to bless his sons with the authority of one who carries an unbreakable covenant legacy. The contrast between physical frailty and spiritual strength was the recurring theme of his life. The Moriah narrative, passed down from father to son, was the foundation of the people's identity. It taught that faith is not an easy comfort, but a journey of extreme trial that demands the surrender of what is most precious to the heart. The skepticism of those who did not understand the depth of obedience was always confronted with the irrefutable fact of the blessing of Abraham and his descendants. Esau's malice and contempt for the birthright, for example, were the antithesis of Isaac's faith, and his loss of the blessing was a manifestation of divine justice that does not tolerate disdain for the promise forged in sacrifice. The melodramatic and solemn tone of the narrative aimed not only at emotion, but also at reverence. Each word was a brushstroke on the canvas of a sacred epic where the protagonist, Abraham, was elevated to the status of a hero of faith. The triumph of his obedience over paternal love was the supreme act of his life, the moment he became the friend of God. This transformation was the culminating point, showing that man can transcend his nature through submission to a higher will. The satisfaction of the triumph was the confirmation that God honors those who honor him above all else. The saga of Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah, with its 50 paragraphs of intensity and detail, was the story of how the eternal is the God who provides. It refused to be superficial, exploring the pain, the doubt, and finally, the ineffable joy of rescue. The account caused indignation at the apparent injustice of the command, but culminated in the glory of the intervention, teaching that the divine design is always perfect, even when incomprehensible. The life of Abraham, the man of trial and promise, was the greatest testament that triumph is an inevitable fulfillment for those who persevere in faith. The conclusion of this epic chronicle lies in the immortality of the name Jehovah-Jireh. That mountain was not merely a geographical location, but an eternal symbol of provision and the test of faith. Whenever future generations found themselves in the midst of trial, the memory of that silent summit and the provided ram restored their hope. The account was an invitation for each person to connect with the story, feeling the weight of Abraham's decision and the relief of his redemption. Abraham's triumph and faithfulness were not an isolated event, but the foundation of a legacy that promised countless and victorious descendants, a prophecy unfolding throughout history. Thus, the saga of Abraham and Isaac on Moriah remains the supreme tale of divine justice and redemption. The contrast between desolation and blessing, between the knife and the ram, is the eternal reminder that the Eternal One demands wholeness, but never annihilation. The narrative, constructed with the solemnity of an omnipresent narrator, fulfilled its purpose of elevating the moral of the story. Unwavering faith will always be rewarded with a triumph that transcends logic and human expectation. The story is not about loss, but about life restored with the seal of the covenant, an epic of redemption that continues to inspire reverence and the certainty of God's protective hand. Do you want more Bible stories filled with faith, teachings, and heartwarming moments? Subscribe and turn on notifications to follow us with each new story.